She only meant to take a short detour, just enough to silence her restless thoughts. She never expected to hear a faint groan echoing from the ravine below, and she definitely never expected to find a man, broken, bloodied, impossibly handsome, looking up at her as if she were the miracle he'd spent his whole life waiting for. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy as Lila lingered behind her hiking group, camera in hand. Her friend Maya had insisted on this weekend trip to Clear Ridge National Park, claiming Lila needed to escape the monotony of her quiet librarian life. But somewhere between the forced enthusiasm and coordinated walking sticks, Lila had found herself craving actual solitude. She veered off the designated path, drawn by a particularly stunning cluster of wildflowers clinging to the rocky slope. The view stretched endlessly, emerald valleys rolling into misty blue mountains. She raised her camera, adjusting the lens, when a sound stopped her cold. A groan. Soft, pained, unmistakably human. Lila's heart lurched. She stepped closer to the ravine's edge, gravel shifting beneath her boots. Peering down the steep drop, she spotted him. A figure sprawled on a narrow ledge perhaps 20 feet below, partially obscured by scrub brush and jutting rock. Her breath caught. He wasn't moving. Every reasonable instinct screamed at her to run back for help. But Lila had never been good at listening to reasonable instincts, especially when someone was hurt. She found a sturdy tree root and began her descent. The climb was treacherous, each foothold testing her nerve. Loose stones skittered into the void. Her hands scraped against rough bark. Halfway down, her foot slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment, she dangled by her fingertips before finding purchase. Still, she continued, driven by stubbornness that had gotten her into and out of trouble her entire life. When she finally reached the ledge, she dropped beside him, breathless and trembling. He was a mess. Blood matted his dark hair, streaked down his temple. His expensive-looking shirt, now torn and dirt-stained, revealed bruising that made her wince. One leg lay at an angle that suggested something was very wrong. Yet even battered and unconscious, there was something striking about him. Strong features, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers or movie screens, though currently pale and drawn with pain. Lila pressed shaking fingers to his neck, nearly sobbing with relief when she felt a pulse. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, and the world shifted. His eyes, startlingly dark, almost black, fixed on her face with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. He stared at her as though she were something mythical, impossible, desperately hoped for but never truly believed in. His cracked lips parted, and he made a sound that might have been a word, but it came out as barely a rasp. Lila found herself frozen, caught in that gaze. Something electric passed between them, though she couldn't name it. She forced herself to break eye contact, fumbling for her phone with trembling hands. No signal, of course. She shouted instead, her voice echoing across the ravine, calling for help until her throat went raw. Between shouts, she looked back down at him, and each time, those dark eyes were still watching her, studying her, drinking in every detail of her face as though memorizing it against some future catastrophe. When she touched his shoulder, just a gentle pressure meant to be reassuring, his entire body seemed to react. He drew in a sharp breath, and something flickered across his expression. Relief? Recognition? An emotion too complex to categorize? Lila kept talking to him, murmuring gentle reassurances, telling him help was coming, that he'd be fine, that he just needed to hold on. She had no idea if any of it was true, but it seemed important. His gaze never wavered from her face. Time became elastic. Her legs cramped from kneeling on the narrow ledge. Her hands grew cold, but she refused to leave him, even when she heard distant voices responding to her calls. The rescue took an eternity. Rangers rappelling down with equipment, securing him to a stretcher, assessing his injuries with professional efficiency. Through it all, he seemed barely aware of anyone except her. When they moved him, a sound of distress escaped his throat, and his hand, the one that wasn't clearly broken, reached out blindly. Lila caught it without thinking, squeezing gently. His fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. As they began lifting him out of the ravine, suspended in the rescue harness with a ranger on either side, his head turned at an awkward angle, still searching for her, still watching with an expression that bordered on panic. Lila scrambled up behind the rescue team, ignoring her protesting muscles. When she reached the top, filthy and exhausted, she found him still staring back at the ravine's edge, at the exact spot where she'd been. His eyes found hers again across the distance, and even as they carried him toward the waiting ambulance, even as Maya rushed over with questions, even as rangers wrapped a blanket around Lila's shoulders, those dark, desperate eyes never left her face, as if terrified she'd disappear, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just shattered, as if seeing her was the only thing keeping him tethered to consciousness at all. The hospital smell hit Lila the moment the automatic doors opened, that combination of antiseptic and anxiety universal to medical facilities. She'd spent the entire ambulance ride answering questions from paramedics, providing what little information she could. She knew nothing. Not his name, not how he'd fallen, not why he'd been alone in that ravine. Nothing except the way he'd looked at her, which seemed to have branded itself permanently into her memory. Maya thought she was insane for insisting on coming to the hospital. Lila was beginning to suspect Maya might be right, yet she found herself in the waiting room anyway, still wearing her dirt-stained hiking clothes, filling out what forms she could. Hours crawled past. Maya eventually left with promises to bring back clean clothes. Other hikers from their group texted concerned messages that Lila barely skimmed. She couldn't explain the compulsion that kept her in that uncomfortable plastic chair. Couldn't justify why her heart raced each time a doctor emerged. This stranger meant nothing to her. She'd done her duty. She should leave. She didn't leave. When a nurse finally approached Rosa, Lila found herself standing before conscious thought, fully formed. Rosa explained. Broken leg, fractured ribs, severe concussion, various lacerations and contusions. He'd been lucky, all things considered. The fall could have killed him. Probably would have, if he'd gone down another few feet to where the ravine dropped off completely. But here was the strange part: he had no identification. No wallet, no phone, nothing. And when he'd regained consciousness, when they'd asked his name, he'd stared at them blankly. He couldn't remember. Not his name, not where he was from, not what had happened. The neurologist suspected the head trauma had caused retrograde amnesia, possibly temporary, but there was no way to know when or if his memory would return. Lila felt something crack open in her chest. This beautiful, broken stranger had no one. Before she could process the impulse, Lila heard herself asking if she could see him. Rosa hesitated, then seemed to read something in Lila's expression that made her nod. The room was private, dimly lit, filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors. He lay, propped up slightly, one leg elevated and casted, bandages visible beneath his hospital gown, a bruise blooming spectacularly across his left cheekbone. His eyes were closed, and for a moment Lila thought he was sleeping. Then they opened. That same intensity crashed over her like a wave. His entire face transformed, pain lines smoothing, peace settling across his features. He drew in a sharp breath, and she watched his pulse jump at his throat. Lila stepped closer, drawn by invisible threads. His gaze tracked her every movement. She saw his fingers twitch against the blanket, as though fighting the urge to reach for her. When she came close enough to touch the bed railing, she watched his eyes flutter closed briefly, his chest expanding with relief. The nurse had said he couldn't speak much, yet his throat was raw from debris inhalation, but he made a sound when Lila smiled tentatively at him. A soft, almost helpless sound that made her heart squeeze. She stayed, pulled up the visitor's chair and settled in, talking quietly about nothing important. The weather, the hospital coffee, the way Maya had nearly fainted at all the blood. He listened as though she were reciting poetry, his eyes never leaving her face. Time slipped away. At some point, Maya returned with clothes and takeout, took one look at the scene, and muttered something about Stockholm Syndrome working in reverse, but she didn't push Lila to leave. Over the next 2 days, a pattern emerged. Lila would arrive each morning, and his eyes would find her immediately, that devastating intensity washing over his features. She'd sit beside his bed reading aloud from her Kindle, or telling him stories about her work at the library. He'd watch her with an attention that was almost overwhelming, his vital signs visibly stabilizing whenever she was near. The nurses noticed. Rosa mentioned, rather pointedly, that he became agitated whenever Lila left, his heart rate spiking, his breathing turning shallow. But when she returned, everything calmed, as though her presence was the only medicine that truly worked. Lila tried to examine her own motivations. This wasn't normal behavior. She didn't know this man, yet something about him called to every protective, nurturing instinct she possessed. And beneath that, something else stirred something that heated her cheeks when he looked at her, that made her hyper-aware of every inch of space between them. On the third day, the doctors cleared him for discharge. That was when reality crashed back in. Where would he go? He had no memory, no identity, no home to return to. The hospital couldn't keep him without medical necessity, and the social worker seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of his situation. Temporary housing, she suggested. They'd work on identification, try to find family. Lila watched him absorb this news, saw something close to panic flicker across his face. He looked at her, really looked, with a desperation that made her throat tight, and she understood. He was terrified of losing sight of her. The social worker was mid-sentence, explaining procedures and paperwork, when Lila heard her own voice cut through the clinical discussion. She offered him her home. The words came out steady despite her racing heart, despite Maya's shocked inhalation on the phone later, despite every reasonable voice in her head screaming about strangers and safety and sanity. He could stay with her, just until his memory returned, until they figured out who he was and where he belonged. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so utterly vulnerable, that Lila felt her resolve cement. Whatever this was, this strange pull, this inexplicable connection, she couldn't walk away from it, from him. When the nurse asked if he understood, if he agreed, he managed his first word in her presence. His voice was rough, damaged from his ordeal, but the single syllable carried more weight than entire conversations. He said yes while looking directly at Lila, and something in his eyes made her wonder if he was answering a completely different question. Lila's apartment had never felt smaller, not because of his physical presence, though he was notably tall, and even injured moved with an unconscious grace that seemed at odds with someone who couldn't remember his own name. No, the apartment felt smaller because he followed her everywhere. Kitchen to bedroom, bedroom to bathroom door, back to kitchen. He limped along on his crutches with single-minded determination, positioning himself wherever he could keep her, in his line of sight. If she disappeared into another room for more than 30 seconds, she'd return to find him attempting to follow despite his injuries, a look of genuine distress creasing his features. Maya called it unhealthy codependence. Lila called it oddly endearing, though she didn't examine why too closely. She'd set him up on her couch with more pillows than any human reasonably needed, stocked the coffee table with books and magazines, positioned the TV remote within easy reach. He ignored all of it. His attention remained fixed on her with an intensity that should have been alarming, but instead made her pulse skip in ways she absolutely refused to analyze. The way he looked at her when she brought him soup, as though she'd handed him something infinitely precious, rather than Campbell's chicken noodle. The careful attention he paid when she explained how to use the TV remote, watching her lips form words with an expression that made her stumble over basic instructions. The visible panic when she mentioned running to the grocery store, quickly soothed only when she promised to be back within the hour. This man, whoever he was, had attached himself to her with the devoted intensity of an imprinted duckling. It was absurd, irrational, completely inappropriate given they'd known each other less than a week. It was also doing dangerous things to her heart. On the fourth morning, Lila was attempting to find him clothes that actually fit his torn, bloody things, having been discarded at the hospital when her doorbell rang. She opened it to find a mountain of a man in an ill-fitting suit, holding a clipboard. He announced he was from Window Maintenance Services, here to inspect her windows. Lila blinked. She glanced at her windows, which were clearly fine, then back at the man, who was sweating profusely despite the mild weather. She explained she hadn't called for any window inspection. The man insisted the building had. Something about routine safety checks. Very important. Wouldn't take long. He was already edging past her into the apartment when his gaze landed on the couch, on the man sitting there, cast propped up, watching this interaction with eyes that had gone absolutely cold. The window inspector froze mid-step. The two men stared at each other. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition crackling like electricity. The visitor's face cycled through shock, relief, and then poorly concealed panic. Lila watched, confused, as her mystery patient gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The window inspector immediately launched into an elaborate inspection of windows that clearly needed no inspecting, occasionally glancing back at the couch with barely suppressed questions. 20 minutes later, he left with assurances that her windows were in excellent condition, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Lila thought that was strange. The next day brought the vacuum salesman. He arrived with what was definitely not a vacuum cleaner. The case was far too heavy, and when he accidentally tilted it, something metallic clanked ominously inside. He insisted it was a revolutionary new model, very exclusive, and did she want a demonstration? Lila politely declined. The salesman's eyes kept darting to the couch, where her patient sat radiating silent menace. The vacuum salesman left abruptly, mumbling about coming back another time. The pizza delivery came on day 3, 20 pizzas, every variety the restaurant offered. Lila tried explaining she hadn't ordered any pizza. The delivery driver, another suspiciously large man in a tight uniform, insisted someone from this address absolutely had. He began reading off a phone number that was definitely not Lila's. When she pointed this out, he glanced toward the living room, made eye contact with the couch's occupant, and seemed to have a complete system failure. He ended up leaving all 20 pizzas with profuse apologies, refusing payment. Lila stood in her tiny kitchen surrounded by pizza boxes, staring at the man on her couch, who was now intensely focused on pretending to read a magazine upside down. Something very strange was happening. The flour delivery came next, then the man who swore he had to read her gas meter despite the fact that her building used electric heating, then someone claiming to be conducting a survey about neighborhood satisfaction who asked increasingly bizarre questions while staring holes into her living room. Each visitor went through the same pattern: arrive with a thin excuse, make eye contact with her patient, visibly panic, and leave quickly. By the end of the week, Lila had started keeping a guest basket by the door: cookies, bottled water, little mints, because these surprise visitors always looked vaguely stressed and she'd been raised to be hospitable, even when completely bewildered. On the 8th day, a new visitor arrived. This one didn't bother with excuses. He was older, gray at the temples, wearing an expensive suit that actually fit. He took one look at Lila and attempted a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained he was looking for his friend, and he believed this was the right address. And could he perhaps come in? Before Lila could answer, her patient appeared behind her on his crutches, moving faster than she'd seen him move all week. The visitor's face transformed. Relief, joy, concern, all cycling across his features in rapid succession. but when he opened his mouth, her patient made a soft sound, almost a warning. The visitor's eyes widened, then cut to Lila. Understanding seemed to dawn, so he launched into the most ridiculous story Lila had ever heard about them being old college roommates, and what a coincidence running into him here, and they really should catch up, and could he perhaps impose for just a few minutes of private conversation? Lila hesitated, looked at her patient, who was staring at the visitor with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, something more complicated. She excused herself to make tea. From the kitchen, she could hear low, intense whispering, fragments of conversation that made no sense. The attack? They think you're dead. We've handled the immediate threat, but when she returned with the tea tray, both men were sitting in careful silence. Her patient's eyes found her immediately, and she watched his entire body relax. The visitor noticed too, studying this reaction with obvious interest. The visitor left shortly after, but not before pressing something into her patient's hand, while Lila was distracted with cleaning up cups. That night, she woke to soft sounds from the living room. She padded out quietly, stopping in the doorway. He sat on the couch, illuminated by the blue glow of a phone she'd never seen before, speaking in a low voice that carried an authority completely at odds with the helpless patient she'd been caring for. He was giving orders, precise, commanding, brooking no argument. Then he seemed to sense her presence. His head turned, eyes finding her in the darkness. Whatever he'd been saying died on his lips. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. She saw conflict play across his face, something caught between truth and protection, between who he was and who he'd been pretending to be. And then he ended the call without breaking eye contact, set the phone aside, and looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered, even as the foundations of her understanding began to crack. The morning light streaming through Lila's apartment windows felt different, as though the world had shifted overnight. She made coffee in silence while he watched from the couch. The easy comfort had evaporated, replaced by something heavy and unspoken. The phone sat on the coffee table now, a small black rectangle that might as well have been a bomb. Lila poured 2 mugs and carried them over, sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining distance for the first time. She watched him notice, watched something crack behind his eyes. When she asked him to tell her the truth, her voice came out steadier than she felt. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, shaking slightly, not from weakness, from something else entirely. Then he started talking. His voice was different now, deeper, controlled. He told her everything, his position, his organization, the empire he'd built in shadows, the enemies who'd betrayed him, who'd lured him to that ravine, his real name, Nicholas Mariano. He explained how his memory had returned gradually while she'd fussed over his pillows, how he'd recognized his men with their ridiculous excuses, how he'd been coordinating his response from her kitchen while she'd baked banana bread and hummed off key. Lila absorbed this, coffee growing cold. She thought about the window inspector's fear, the pizza driver's panic, the way that visitor had looked at him with unmistakable deference, all the strange pieces suddenly making sense. She asked why he hadn't told her. His composure cracked. She watched him struggle for words, his throat working around emotions he clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. He'd been terrified that she'd look at him differently, that the gentle warmth would drain from her eyes, because he'd built his life on power and violence, and she was soft and kind, everything his world wasn't, and the thought of losing the way she looked at him. He couldn't finish, didn't need to. Lila felt her heart constrict. She asked if any of it had been real, his helplessness, his attachment, the way he looked at her. His eyes snapped to hers with such intensity she felt it like a physical touch. He told her that was the realest thing that had ever happened to him, that in that ravine, he had opened his eyes to find her face and felt something shift fundamentally, that every moment since her gentle hands, her terrible jokes, the way she'd brought him home without hesitation, had been rewriting something essential in him, that he'd been lost long before the amnesia, and she'd been the first thing to make him feel found, that she'd scared him more than any enemy ever had, because what she made him feel was so overwhelming, he had no context for it. Lila felt tears prick her eyes. Part of her wanted to be angry, but a larger part recognized the truth in his words, in the way his hands trembled, in the naked vulnerability on his face. She told him she needed time to think, watched something die behind his eyes even as he nodded, watched him reach for his crutches. She stopped him, clarified that she needed time to process, not for him to disappear, because despite everything, she couldn't deny what had been building between them. He sank back onto the couch, relief and hope warring across his features. That night, he left in some other way. She heard him making calls, his voice carrying that command that explained everything. By morning, he told her it was finished. The threat eliminated, his enemies dealt with. He said it matter-of-factly, but she saw the weight of it. 3 days passed in careful orbit. He gave her space, though she caught him watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. She went through her routine, acutely aware of his presence. On the 4th night, Lila made a decision. She found him on the couch and sat down beside him, not at the opposite end this time, close enough that their knees almost touched. She told him she'd been falling for him since she'd climbed down into that ravine, not because he'd needed her, but because of the way he'd looked at her, like she was something precious, like her presence alone could heal wounds deeper than broken bones. She admitted it terrified her, but she'd spent her whole life being careful and reasonable, never taking risks, never feeling anything that made her heart race. Until him. She watched his face transform, watched hope kindle like a flame catching. When she finished, he slid off the couch, cast and all, and knelt in front of her, took her hands with a gentleness that seemed impossible. His thumb traced circles on her palm, and she felt that touch everywhere. He told her he'd never believed in fate, but then he'd opened his eyes in that ravine and seen her face, and everything had shattered, that she had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with calling for rescue, that thinking about leaving her had been more frightening than anything he'd ever faced, that he'd never needed anything the way he needed her as the thing that made him want to be better. His voice dropped, rough with emotion. He asked if she'd marry him. The question hung between them, absurd and perfect and completely insane. They'd known each other less than 3 weeks. Every rational thought screamed that this was too fast, too impossible. But when she looked into his eyes, those dark eyes that had first caught hers in a ravine, she didn't see danger. She saw someone who'd been lost and found, broken and healing, powerful yet utterly undone by someone who'd chosen to see him as human. She saw her own feelings reflected back, magnified, undeniable. Lila felt tears spill over as she nodded. The smile that broke across his face was so genuinely joyful that it stole her breath. He surged up and gathered her carefully into his arms. The embrace was tender and desperate, and full of promises that needed no words. He held her as though she were infinitely precious, as though he'd finally found the place he belonged after a lifetime of searching. Lila buried her face in his shoulder and felt his heart racing against hers. When they finally pulled apart, he cupped her face gently, reverently, and looked at her with such overwhelming tenderness that she felt tears fall. Outside, the city hummed with its evening rhythm. Inside Lila's tiny apartment, 2 people who should never have found each other held tight to something impossible and real and absolutely right. The man she'd found in a ravine, broken, bleeding, looking at her like she was a miracle, was hers now, and she was his. And whatever came next, They'd face it together, just as soon as he figured out how to navigate stairs with a cast on. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight was for holding on, for feeling hearts race in tandem, for the smile that wouldn't leave either of their faces.